For over 4 centuries, thousands and thousands of ships have been lost to the Great Lakes. Either they've been sunk in a collision with another ship in fog, have sunk after striking some shoals or shallows and foundered, or lost in a fierce storm which sent many ships and their crews to the bottom of the lake. But sometimes, shipwrecks on the Great Lakes can be a little bit different and more dangerous. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ivan, and join me today as we discover the top 5 worst shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, in terms of lives lost. Number 5. The SS Noronic. Not to be confused with the livestock carrier SS Noronic, which I have a video about by the way, the SS Noronic was a Great Lakes passenger steamship owned and operated by the Canada Steamship Lines, or CSL for short. The ship was built by the Western Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company in Port Arthur, Ontario, and the vessel was launched on June 2, 1913. The ship measured 362 feet, or 110 meters in length. She came in at nearly 7,000 gross registered tons, and she had a capacity for 6,000 passengers and 200 crew. The ship had 8 sister ships, the most notable being the SS Huronic, introduced in 1902, as well as the SS Hamonic, introduced in 1909. The Noronic navigated the Great Lakes for the next 36 years, transporting passengers and cargo all around the lakes, and even running cruises in the area. And it was during her career that she was given the nickname Queen of the Lakes, until 1949, when she set out on what would be her final voyage. On September 14, 1949, the Noronic, now 36 years old, departed Detroit for a 7-day pleasure cruise of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, where she would sail through Lake Ontario, stop at Toronto along the way, and sail up the St. Lawrence River through the Thousand Islands region, and arrive in Prescott, Ontario, and then sail back through Lake Ontario and Lake Erie before returning to Sarnia, Ontario. On the evening of September 16th, the Noronic arrived in Toronto Harbor where she docked at Pier 9. While docked, many passengers had left the ship to explore the city, while others stayed on the ship and went to the lounge or to dinner. The passengers who had left the ship to explore the city had returned to the Noronic just after 10 p.m. A few hours later at 2:30 p.m., a fire insurance specialist by the name of Don Church was returning to his cabin on the ship when he noticed a haze in the air around him, as well as the smell of a burning object. Shortly after, the haze had grown into a cloud of smoke, and he discovered a fire in a locked linen closet. Almost immediately, Church went to tell a nearby crew member of the fire in the locked closet, but instead of pulling the fire alarm, he instead went to grab the keys for the closet. When he returned, he unlocked the door, but when he did, the fire burst out and engulfed the wood-paneled corridors. Church and 2 other crew members tried to put out the flames with fire extinguishers, but they failed to put it out. Afterward, Church went to alert his family of the fire on board. About 30 minutes later, half of the ship's decks were engulfed in flames. The first mate sounded the fire alarm, but failed to get most of the passengers' attention. On top of that, the Noronic's whistle was actually malfunctioning, and the captain wasn't even on the ship when the fire started. Many of the passengers were still asleep in their cabins when the decks were consumed in flames, and even if they were woken up by the sound of the other passengers and the fire alarm, it's likely that they would have no way to escape their cabins. For those who managed to get through the smoke-filled corridors and up onto the top deck, they faced yet another problem. The ship was constantly moving back and forth away from the pier, and if the passengers tried to jump off the deck, they would most likely get crushed between the hull of the ship and the concrete pier. Soon, a ladder was raised to the ship to aid the survivors, which did help the passengers and crew to a certain extent. Later, both the fire department and police had come to rescue the passengers and put out the fire, but it continued to rage on. When the fire did eventually go out, the ship was now a gutted shell that rested on the bottom of Toronto Harbor. A few months after the fire, the ship was salvaged from the bottom of the harbor and was towed to Hamilton, Ontario to be scrapped. It's estimated that at least 119 people lost their lives when the Noronic caught fire. It's never been confirmed by what caused the fire in the linen closet that caused the ship to burst into flames. But after the incident, safety regulations on Great Lakes steamers had been changed, and the fire aboard Noronic remains not only one of the deadliest maritime disasters on the Great Lakes, but also one of the deadliest fires on board any vessel, up there with fires aboard the Yarmouth Castle, the cruise ship Laconia, the Doña Paz, and many more. Number 4. The SS Atlantic. No, not that one. Nope, not that one either. Still not that one. Okay, so this is the one I'm talking about. The Atlantic was one of the earliest steamboats ever put to use on the Great Lakes. She was built in either 1848 or 1849. She was a decent size for her time at 267 feet or 81 meters in length and came in at 1,155 tons. At this time, steam technology aboard ships was very new, especially for the Great Lakes. In fact, the Atlantic was larger and faster than many ships of her time. On August 19, 1852, the Atlantic departed Buffalo, New York, bound for Detroit, and stopped in Erie, Pennsylvania along the way. Among the passengers on board were Norwegian immigrants destined for the farmlands of the Midwest. That night there was no moon, and the warm air mixed with a haze that was building over the lake. At the same time, the steamer Ogdensburg was making her voyage from Cleveland to New York City. Early that next morning, the crew of the Ogdensburg could see the Atlantic in the distance. However, based on the direction the ship was going, the crew thought that the Atlantic would pass the Ogdensburg about a half mile apart from each other. However, when the crew of the Atlantic noticed the Ogdensburg off in the distance, they immediately changed course when the Ogdensburg stayed on her course, which put the Atlantic straight in the path of the Ogdensburg. Only a few minutes later, the Ogdensburg had struck the side of the Atlantic midship on her port side. It was about 2:30 in the morning, and some of the passengers had been awakened from the jolt of the impact. Not long after the collision, the crew of the Atlantic began to sail towards Long Point, which was only a few miles away, and attempt to beach the ship. To the crew, the Atlantic did not appear to be heavily damaged. The bow of the Ogdensburg was heavily crushed by the impact, but she remained afloat. And the ship had actually drifted about 2 miles away from the ship following the collision, until Captain Richardson of the Ogdensburg ordered the ship to turn around and head back towards the area where the Atlantic was. Despite the fact that from the deck of the Ogdensburg, the Atlantic had been heavily damaged in the collision, to many on board the Atlantic, the ship appeared to be okay and not in danger of sinking, and although the passengers didn't know it, they were in a fight for their lives. Soon, the engine room had been flooded, and when the Atlantic was moving forward as the hull was filling with water, the forward movement of the ship forced more water into the hull. Despite the desperate situation, the crew made no effort to wake up the passengers who were asleep in their cabins, and many had drowned in their cabins. Some passengers had come up on deck after the collision, where they were given no instructions on where to go, all the while the ship was developing a significant list to her port side, while also going down by the head. One lifeboat was awkwardly lowered from its davits, and it capsized and dumped its occupants into the lake, and many passengers decided to jump into the water from the deck instead, which gave the several hundred passengers little means to escape the sinking vessel. 2 other lifeboats were launched, which were almost entirely filled with crew members, and left many passengers stranded on the ship. As the ship continued to go down, the Atlantic's twin funnels came loose and collapsed, crushing several people in the process. Fortunately, there was hope for some of the passengers. While many of the passengers were struggling for their lives in the water, through the fog, they saw some lights that were not far away. It was the Ogdensburg, which had come back to rescue the crew and the passengers of the sinking vessel. By that time, the Atlantic had her stern rose up above the water, and her bow was buried in the bottom of the lake. And some of the surviving passengers had actually clung onto the stern of the ship that was still above the water, while the living and the dead passengers were thrown from the ship. The crew of the Ogdensburg managed to save hundreds of survivors from the water that night, and brought the survivors back to Erie, Pennsylvania, the same place that they had departed only a few hours earlier. By that time, the Atlantic was now resting on the bottom of Lake Erie. It's never been confirmed on how many people lost their lives that night, but it's estimated that at least 250 people lost their lives when the ship sank. For those who survived, the city of Erie, as well as other cities in the area, offered the surviving passengers free hotel rooms, free telegram transmission, food, and clothing, since many of them had lost most of their belongings when the ship went down. Following the incident, an inquiry was held to figure out who was to blame. In 1859, 7 years after the disaster, the U.S. Supreme Court found both vessels guilty of the disaster, but it was also determined that the weather conditions that night had also altered the visibility aboard both vessels, and made it so that they thought they were sailing in one direction when they were actually sailing in a completely different direction. The wreck was discovered in 1984 by Canadian diver Michael Fletcher at a depth of 150 feet at the bottom of Lake Erie. In 1996, the Ontario government declared the wreck a burial site, and that it should be left undisturbed by divers. Nonetheless, the sinking of the paddle steamer Atlantic is one of the worst shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. Number 3. The SS G.P. Griffith. The G.P. Griffith was a wooden-hulled Great Lakes paddle steamer, much like the Atlantic we just talked about. She was launched in 1848 in Maumee, Ohio, and was named after a businessman in the area. She measured 193 feet or 59 meters in length and came in at 587 tons. She navigated the lakes for the next few years with little to no incidents. On June 16, 1850, the Griffith departed Buffalo, New York, bound for Toledo, Ohio, with over 300 passengers on board. On the way, they would stop in Erie, Pennsylvania, Fairport, Ohio, and Cleveland, before then heading to Toledo. That night was calm, and many passengers had actually decided to sleep up on the hurricane deck rather than in their cabins, which they had paid for. At about 3 a.m., the wheelsman was on deck when he noticed spark coming from near the ship's funnel. He alerted the first mate, and soon some of the crew tried to extinguish the fire with buckets of water, but no matter how much water they poured on the flames, it wouldn't go out. Afterward, the fire alarm was sounded, and passengers rushed to get to the boat deck, while also navigating through smoke-filled hallways. As the flames began to consume the wooden hull of the ship, the captain had calculated that they were only a few miles away from the shore. Acting quickly, he ordered the ship to steam ahead in order to beach her, in order to enable the passengers a safe exit from the crippled ship. The ship steamed at full speed towards the shore, but it only made the fire spread towards the stern of the vessel, and since they were still moving, the smoldered lifeboats could not be launched. Soon, the top deck was completely engulfed in flames, meaning that anyone still on the top deck had nowhere to run, and they were in huge danger. As the ship raced toward shore, many of the passengers and crew on deck used whatever they could find to put out the flames, to no avail. Shortly thereafter, there was an aggressive lurch, and the Griffith came to a stop. The passengers and crew assumed that they had made it to shore and it would be easy to escape now, but they soon found out that they had actually run aground on a sandbar instead of the beach, about half a mile away from the shore. At this point, there was nothing the passengers could do except jump from the ship and swim for the shore, and hope for the best. The ship was unable to free itself from the sandbar, and as the passengers jumped from the deck, some passengers got sucked into the paddle wheel which was still turning, and those passengers got crushed from the rotating blades. Local residents could see the flame in the distance that lit up the dark waters of Lake Erie, and soon the bodies of the victims began to wash ashore. Soon the ship was nothing more than a buried hulk of its former self, and soon dipped beneath the surface. In the end, out of the 326 passengers and crew on board that night, 286 of them lost their lives, and it remains the deadliest shipwreck on Lake Erie and the third worst maritime disaster on the Great Lakes, even deadlier than the fire aboard the SS Noronic nearly 100 years later. Number 2. The P.S. Lady Elgin. You might be noticing a pattern here. The Lady Elgin was a wooden-hulled side-wheel steamer built in 1851. Much like the Atlantic and G.P. Griffith we just talked about, she was also one of the earliest paddle steamers ever used on the Great Lakes. She was built by the Bidwell and Banta shipyard in Buffalo, New York, and she was completed in 1851. She measured 252 feet, or 77 meters in length, and came in at 1,038 gross tons. She navigated the Great Lakes for the next 9 years, changing her route several times, and even becoming a favorite among the general public. In her later years, she usually made trips across Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Superior until 1860, when her luck finally ran out. At 11:30 p.m. on September 7, 1860, the Lady Elgin departed Chicago on a routine voyage across Lake Michigan for Milwaukee. As the ship departed Chicago, it was reported that the vessel was overcrowded, with between 300 to 600 people on board, when there was supposed to be significantly less people on board. However, nobody on board seemed to care if the ship was overcrowded, as she plowed through the waters of Lake Michigan. That night, Captain Jack Wilson was on the bridge. As he looked out across the lake, many of the passengers were still up partying, and shortly after, he retired to his quarters for the night. The ship's band was still playing on deck when storm clouds started to build over the vessel, and soon light rain began to fall, but that didn't stop the passengers from partying in the saloon. However, the light rain soon turned into a thunderstorm over Lake Michigan. The Lady Elgin had most of her lights still on in the early morning hours of September 8th, as most of the passengers were still awake. But as the party continued, many of the passengers fell asleep on the sofas in the lounge or retired to their cabins. As the Lady Elgin was battling her way through the rough seas, another ship, the 128-foot wooden schooner Augusta, was also battling her way through the storm. Unlike the Lady Elgin, the Augusta did not have her running lights on, making it so that she would only be seen if a bolt of lightning lit up the stormy sky. At 2:30 a.m., the passengers on the Lady Elgin who were still awake felt a tremendous jolt go through the port side of the ship, as well as the sound of an explosion. Anyone who was asleep on the sofas or in bed were knocked off by the impact. Some say that the impact had doused every lamp on the ship and plunged the vessel into darkness. The captain who had been awakened by the impact had rushed to the bridge to see what was going on. To his horror, he discovered that the Augusta, the schooner that was also battling the storm not far away, had smashed into the Lady Elgin's wooden hull, midship. After the collision, the Augusta's bow was low in the water, and the crew feared that the ship was in danger of sinking, so they set a course for Chicago. To the crew who just made this decision, the Lady Elgin didn't seem to be in distress. This decision would remain controversial for the next few decades. The captain of the Lady Elgin immediately went to inspect the damage. To his horror, he found a gaping hole on the side of the ship, below the waterline. He ordered the crew to release the cargo from the ship's hold and into the water, hoping that it would lighten the ship and keep her afloat. The crew released the cargo into the stormy waters, but it failed to keep the ship from sinking. Afterward, the crew tried covering the hole with mattresses and other materials to slow the sinking, but the water continued to fill the ship. About 30 minutes later, the ship had exploded, sending pieces of the ship's hull into the stormy seas. Many passengers were killed as this happened. For those who survived the explosion, they were in a fight for their lives as they were tossed around in the storm. Many tried to cling on to pieces of the ship that had been thrown from the ship after the explosion, and some even clung onto the hull, which was still partly above water. They ripped doors off the side of the ship and tried to get anything they could to stay afloat long enough to make it to shore. A few hundred people managed to stay afloat long enough to have a view of the nearby beach at Winnetka, Illinois, but unfortunately they were dragged down by the forces of the monstrous waves. By dawn, the residents of Winnetka came to the beach to see bodies of the passengers and crew of the Lady Elgin washed up on shore, with each wave bringing in another body onto the beach. In the end, less than 100 of the passengers survived the disaster, and 297 of them lost their lives that night. The bodies of the victims continued to wash on the shores of Lake Michigan several weeks after the ship sank. Today, the sinking of the paddle steamer Lady Elgin remains one of the deadliest and most tragic shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. And finally, the worst shipwreck on the Great Lakes in terms of lives lost is the SS Eastland. On top of being the deadliest shipwreck on the Great Lakes, it is arguably the most controversial disaster on the Great Lakes, with many changes and instances over her career that slowly built up to this horrifying disaster. The death toll from every single disaster we covered up to this point in the video combined is not much higher than the death toll of the Eastland disaster. The story of the Eastland begins in 1902, when a Canadian immigrant and politician known as Robert R. Blacker founded the Michigan Steamship Company based out of Michigan City, Indiana. You see, at that time, there was a high demand for steamship transportation across Lake Michigan. For example, tourists in the area were taking trips to Chicago, and Chicago residents were moving out of the city. Plus, markets in Chicago wanted fresh fruit from the farms around Lake Michigan. Blacker hoped to name the ship the City of South Haven. They were in a competition for that name because while the Michigan Steamship Company was drawing out plans for this new ship, another company, the well-established South Haven Line, was also planning a new ship for the same route, and they also wanted to name their ship the City of South Haven. So in order to take the rights for the name, they had to complete their ship sooner than the Michigan Steamship Company. Unfortunately, the South Haven Line launched their ship first and stole the name City of South Haven. So the Michigan Steamship Company was forced to come up with a new name. They held a contest, and the winner chose the name Eastland. The Michigan Steamship Company had previously contracted the Jenks Shipbuilding Company in Port Huron, Michigan to construct the Eastland, and the ship was launched on May 6, 1903, to a crowd of almost 6,000 people. She was nearly fully fitted out when launched, so it wouldn't be long until she entered service. She measured 265 feet or 81 meters in length, had a beam of 38 feet or 12 meters, and came in at 1,961 gross tons. She had 4 coal-fired Scotch Marine boilers that powered 2 triple expansion steam engines for a top speed of 16.5 knots. During the design process of the Eastland, she was originally designed well and stable, but as construction progressed, her hull was shortened by 60 feet or 18 meters, and a new deck was added. If these new changes resulted in any instability issues, she was given ballast tanks. However, these ballast tanks introduced another issue. Both sides of tanks spanned all the way from the center to the outside hull of the ship. When these tanks were full, it didn't have any problem with the stability. However, when they were partially filled, which they usually were, the water had space to flow back and forth. As the ship rolled in the waves and swells, even the water on the opposite side of the list would shift that way too. Usually when this does happen, the process reaches a certain limit, but outside forces can play a role in making the ship roll further than the limit. The Eastland sea trials took her from the shipyard in Port Huron, across Lake Huron, through the Straits of Mackinac, across Lake Michigan, and into South Haven, Michigan, and she sailed her maiden voyage on July 16, 1903. Now, I'm not going to go over everything that happened during the Eastland's career, but throughout her career, the ship suffered regular stability issues. Her ballast tanks didn't work well, and because of that, she bottomed out often, destroying more than a dozen of her propeller blades over the next few months. At the end of the 1903 season, she was returned to the Jenks shipyard for modifications. First, air conditioning was installed throughout the ship, and her draft was reduced, which increased her speed. On the other hand, it added weight, and raised the ship's center of gravity quite significantly. and following this refit, the ship became even more unstable. Following an incident in July 1904, when the Eastland nearly capsized while en route from South Haven to Chicago, new operating regulations were ordered. Most of the ship's ballast tanks need to be full at all times. Her passenger capacity was reduced, the vessel's draft had to be increased, and a temporary ban for her passengers to be on her top deck was put in place. The ship was brought to the shipyard for refits, but while this was happening, the Michigan Steamship Company crashed financially, and Robert Blacker, the president of the company, sold the Eastland to himself, and partnered up with their previous rival, the South Haven Line, to form a new company, the Michigan Transportation Company, and the Eastland's green hull was painted white. And in 1906, the ship nearly capsized near her dock in Chicago, almost in the exact spot where she would face disaster 9 years later. In 1907, Blacker left the Michigan Steamship Company and took the Eastland with him. The ship would now sail along Lake Erie between Cleveland, Cedar Point, and Toledo, Ohio. And she continued this route for another few years, becoming a favorite among those who sailed on her. But soon, the demand for the ship on this route had declined, and she was put up for sale in 1913. Not long afterward, the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company had purchased the Eastland on the recommendation of the manager of the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company, A.A. Shaws, which brought the Eastland back to Chicago, where she would haul passengers and fruit across Lake Michigan once again. And the ship was given a new captain by this company, Harry Paterson. That same year, the Western Electric Hawthorne Works, which was a large 250-acre complex with whole neighborhoods and factories, had chartered the Eastland and several other steamers for an excursion across Lake Michigan to Michigan City, Indiana, where they hosted a picnic for the company's employees, something they did almost every year. But the 1915 excursion would be where the Eastland met its demise. On July 24, 1915, the Eastland was at the Clark Street Wharf in Chicago. It was overcast outside, with light drizzle, and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The Eastland, as well as the 5 other ships nearby, were all chartered by Western Electric for the 1915 excursion to Michigan City. The Eastland was the first ship departing on this charter. Afterward, the SS Theodore Roosevelt would depart, then the steamer May would. Petoskey, Racine, and Rochester would all follow the Eastland across Lake Michigan to Michigan City. First, the Eastland would depart Chicago to drop off the picnickers in Michigan City, but would return to Chicago to run its regularly scheduled voyage to St. Joseph. Then it would stop in Michigan City to pick up the picnickers and take them back to Chicago. Then it had an overnight charter from Chicago to St. Joseph. At 6:30 a.m., the travelers began boarding the Eastland at a rate of about 50 passengers per minute. Many of the passengers dispersed throughout the vessel, and although the deck was wet from the rain, many passengers continued to head up on deck to wave to their families. However, within 10 minutes of the boarding process, the ship began listing to starboard, due to the fact that most of the passengers were on the starboard side, but most of the coal in the ship's bunkers was on the port side, opposite the list. Shortly after, the vessel came back on an even keel, and the boarding process continued. Soon the vessel developed a slight list to her port side, but the passengers continued boarding the ship. By 7:10 a.m., the Eastland's boarding process had finished. The gangplanks were brought in, and the stern lines were cast off. Captain Paterson ran the engines to standby and signaled for the Clark Street Bridge to open so they could depart. The operators on the bridge refused the request, telling the captain that his ship was listing too hard to depart. The captain ordered the ballast tanks to be filled to correct the list, and have the passengers move to the opposite side of the ship was listing. These efforts were unsuccessful. On top of that, the ship's gangways had taken on water, which made the list even greater. At 7:28 a.m., the Eastland suddenly lurched to 45 degrees. Glasses and plates fell off their shelves, and the refrigerator in the saloon tipped over. It slid across the floor and slammed into the wall, pinning 2 women against a wall. And so did the piano on the promenade deck. As the ship rolled over, the passengers on deck jumped into the river to avoid being sucked down. The ship came to rest on the riverbed shortly afterward. None of the lifeboats could be launched due to how fast it rolled over. One boat did break free from its davits, and a 6-year-old climbed aboard it. The ship was now deep into the sand on the bottom. The river was filled with screaming men, women, and children, many of whom drowned after some pulled each other down, and some were able to break the surface due to how many people were in the water, and some were even standing on each other's shoulders. The nearby tugboat Kenosha, which had been preparing to assist the Eastland's departure, positioned itself between the ship and the wharf. I'm not going to go into everything about the rescue and recovery, but in the end, 844 people on board lost their lives, 837 passengers, 2 crew, 4 hired staff on board, and a crewman from the nearby steamer Petoskey, who leapt into the water to save a woman he saw struggling in the water. Both he and the woodman didn't survive the ordeal. The Eastland's operators contracted the Great Lakes Towing Company for the salvage of the ship, with a salvage tug known as the Favorite coming down the Chicago River to right the ship. Once the ship was righted, the Eastland's owners put the hulk of the ship up for auction, with only 2 bidders. One wanted to purchase it to use as a coastal freighter, while the other, Captain Edward Everett, wanted to purchase it for use as a naval training ship, and it was sold to him. Eastland's hull was rebuilt, and she was converted into a U.S. Navy gunboat and renamed the USS Wilmette, after a Chicago suburb. Once she was completed, the First World War had come to an end, but she did sink a German U-boat after the war ended because of the Treaty of Versailles. The rest of her career was pretty uneventful, and she continued as a naval training vessel during the Second World War and even hosted President Franklin Roosevelt once. In 1947, the Wilmette, or former Eastland, was scrapped, still resembling her old Eastland cell. While she may be long gone, the site where the disaster happened in downtown Chicago does have a commemoration plaque of the disaster, and the Chicago History Museum even has some artifacts from the ship. But in the end, the Eastland disaster is arguably one of the most controversial disasters on the Great Lakes, and more than 800 people lost their lives when this accident took place. This disaster is an example of what happens when you prioritize profits over safety, and unfortunately, this wouldn't be the last time something like this has ever happened. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Obviously, I left a lot out in this video. This is meant to be an introduction to the 5 worst shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. It's been a long time since I uploaded last, but I put a lot of time and effort into these videos. So if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you know whenever I post a new video. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.